The Tactician is one of 5 new ascendancies coming to Path of Exile 2 as part of the Dawn of the Hunt update. And in this video I'm going to be taking a look at this ascendancy, discussing exactly what it can do and what builds you may see being played on this one. Let's get straight into it, beginning with a solid plan, which is the first notable in a 2-choice 4-point branch. Firstly, note the 8% increased spirit, which is very solid for a small passive, especially considering the modifier on the notable. Persistent buffs have 50% less reservation. Now this is really strong. You're going to be able to reserve a lot more buffs with this node. For example, Combat Frenzy will only reserve 15 spirit baseline instead of 30. And you have things like Wind Dancer, Scavenged Plating, Overwhelming Presence. All of those 30 spirit reservations are only going to reserve 15 spirit baseline when you have this notable. But you do of course need to have the gem socket links to be able to fit those skills in. Now one thing to mention about this node is the 100 plus new support gems that are coming in this patch. And the chance that we get new persistent buff support gems like Vitality or Clarity is quite high. Remember, even though they're support gems, something like Vitality is still a persistent buff. It's tagged as a persistent buff and it's usually going to reserve 20 spirit, and with this node it will only reserve 10. All of the Herald skills are persistent buffs too, even though they're likely to get heavily nerfed in this patch. But also consider how powerful this notable is in allowing you to reserve a bunch of those high cost buffs very cheaply. For example, Blink will cost you 30 spirit to reserve. Cast on Crit will be 50 spirit instead of 100. And yes, all of those trigger gems are considered to be persistent buffs as well, so they work with this node too. So because there are so many options for persistent buffs, this is just a very generically strong node. You can grab it with pretty much any build you're going for. And it also begins right at the start of the ascendancy for 2 points spent, so you're going to be able to fit it in many of those builds too. Now, branching off of this node is 2 different notables, and each of these are a lot more specific in terms of what builds you will be wanting to use with these. Watch how I do it. Allies in your presence gain added attack damage equal to 25% of your main hand's weapon damage. Now this one is probably going to have some interesting implications with specters that are arriving in this patch. I'm sure there will be some mob type that abuses flat damage like crazy, but I actually see this node as more of a party support playstyle than anything else. And that's because if you're playing minions, you can't really afford to give up your scepter, gem levels and spirit. So you can't use a 2-hander here, which would be ideal for flat damage. You could use a 1-hander for the flat damage along with the scepter, but I'm not convinced that will be that great. There's also totems, but right now all of the totems that we have in the game scale massive flat damage from gem levels, so I don't think that's too useful either. However, from a party support perspective in group play, this node is decent. Then we have the other branching option, whoever pays best. Can place multiple banners. Now aside from War Banner, banners are generally a bit weak in Path of Exile 2 right now, so hopefully they receive some attention in the upcoming patch. But as of right now, I don't see many people picking this one up. Okay, let's move on to the next 4-point branch, beginning with Suppressing Fire. Projectile damage builds Pin. So Pinned is a debuff that essentially acts as a root. It binds the target in place, and while they're pinned, they cannot move. The default base duration of Pin is 4 seconds, and notably, Pin is quite easy to build up compared to things like Freeze. When a target is pinned, they are also considered to be immobilized, and you can take advantage of that with something like the Leverage support gem for 50% increased critical hit chance. But perhaps more notable than that is Siege Cascade, which is a crossbow projectile damage ability, so you'll be able to use this to actually build up the pin from Suppressing Fire, but the skill itself has a built-in 50% more damage against immobilized enemies, which is any enemy you pin. So, decent 2-point node, but this is made a lot stronger with the next node in the branch, right where we want them. Pinned enemies cannot perform actions. Okay, this is very strong. An enemy that is pinned and cannot perform actions literally cannot do anything. They can't move, they can't attack or cast spells, they just have to stand there idle for the full duration of the pin. That's crazy. Freeze is already extremely strong in PoE2, but Freeze is much harder to inflict compared to Pin. So this node is essentially going to turn your Pin into a pseudo Freeze, and while mapping, you're mostly just going to be pinning everything you hit with projectile damage. You can invest a bit more into Pin on the passive tree to make it a bit easier to build up, and if you can't reach it, Pin and Run is a great anoint for 5% move speed, which is going to be up most of the time. This is an incredibly good 4-point branch overall. Now moving on to the next 4-point branch, beginning with Polish That Gear. Gain 100% armor as extra stun threshold, and 100% of evasion as extra ailment threshold. So, how this works usually is your stun and ailment threshold are based on your maximum life to begin with. So if you have 3,200 maximum life, let's say, you will have 3,200 stun threshold and 3,200 ailment threshold. These numbers are used to calculate if a hit will stun you or inflict ailments on you. Shock, for example, has 1% chance to be inflicted on you per 4% of ailment threshold that was dealt by a hit. But Polish That Gear allows you to potentially add a huge amount to these thresholds. For example, just having 5,000 armor will boost your stun threshold by more than double. And considering we don't have easy access to fully avoiding stuns or ailments in PoE2, I think this is a pretty great 2-point investment, especially if ailments are going to become more dangerous in 0.2 as we expect they will. And the thing is, this node kind of goes crazy at the high end. If you have 12,000 or 15,000 armor and evasion rating, you're getting into the territory of being pretty much immune to stuns and ailments. Nothing is going to reasonably deal enough damage to have any kind of good chance to stun you or cause an ailment. So Polish That Gear is a great node on its own. Now, branching off of this is Stay Light, Use Cover. This is where things get a bit interesting. Defend with 200% of armor, enemies have an accuracy penalty against you based on distance. Maximum evade chance is 50%, maximum physical damage reduction is 50%. Okay, let's discuss the evasion portion of this notable first. As a player, you have an accuracy penalty based on how far you are from a monster, but usually monsters don't have that. With this node, that will be imposed on them. This penalty scales up to 90% less accuracy rating at maximum distance, which is 12 meters. That's pretty good, especially on a ranged character where you're always trying to keep your distance from monsters. You can really benefit from this modifier. However, maximum evade chance is 50%. Now, in the context of current PoE2, this is just simply bad. It's quite trivial right now to get enough evasion where you're at 80 or 85% evade chance in high tier maps against average monsters. However, the usefulness of this node in terms of the evasion portion is going to come down to the changes they make in this patch to this defense. If it's significantly harder to reach high evade chance, this node immediately becomes a lot stronger. And overall, what this node does for evasion is that it essentially makes a low amount of total evasion rating be a lot more effective by making monsters have less accuracy to weigh against your evasion. Now, the other half of this node is a lot more interesting, at least to me. Defend with 200% of armor, maximum physical damage reduction is 50%. So some of you will recognize similar wording on the imbalanced guard keystone from PoE1. Defending with 200% of armor means that any incoming hit that will interact with your armor will use double your total armor for the calculation of damage reduction that it provides. Now, armor is at the opposite end of the scale compared to evasion, where we're hopefully looking at buffs to this mechanic in the upcoming patch. This is providing a similar benefit to the evasion half of the node, where a low amount of armor is considerably more effective because it's being doubled for the calculation. But by capping the damage reduction for physical damage at 50%, it means that a lot of the smaller incoming hits are going to do a lot more damage to you, where you may have previously been mitigating those hits by a lot more than 50%. So overall, you're typically going to take more damage from smaller physical hits and less damage from larger physical hits. But what about armor applying to non-physical damage? Here's where things get really interesting. Black Braid is a unique body armor that makes armor apply to elemental damage taken from hits. Now, currently in PoE2, armor being applied to elemental or chaos damage is calculated before resistances, and that makes it a lot worse than how it works in PoE1. This is because elemental damage hits coming in from monsters are typically a lot higher to account for resistances, and therefore the larger damage hit crushes your armor and armor doesn't really end up doing too much. However, this notable specifically caps your physical damage reduction at 50%, but it makes you defend with 200% of armor for any hit that uses your armor. Therefore, Black Braid's modifier would benefit from the double armor without being hit by the downside. Now, this is cool and that's a great interaction to use, but right now armor is not in a good place in terms of balance. But if armor gets some adjustments in this patch or in the future, this will be an interesting combo to look at. Okay, we have 2 branches left and these are both 2-pointers. First we have Unleash Hell. We got to see this skill in action a little bit in the reveal video and to be honest it looks pretty bad. But who knows? This is a pretty interesting skill design-wise because these are minions which are off-screen. They're not actually with you. And you can use the skill to rain down a bunch of arrows on a location. The minions scale based on your dexterity and strength, so a bit of an attribute stacking angle there. But really, without the base damage numbers, we don't really know how good this skill will be. Then, the last 2-pointer is Cannons Ready. Totems have 30% more skill speed, and totems only use skills when you fire an attack projectile. So we already have this exact mechanic in PoE1, it's the focused ballista support gem, and it's not great. Now the biggest issue here for me is that a totem playstyle is usually allowing your totems to do all of the work while you focus on avoiding getting hit. But this node stops totems from using their skills until you specifically use a skill to fire an attack projectile. So in general, I'm not a fan of this node for mapping, which is most of the game. However, there's something to be said here for single target damage. 30% more skill speed is a lot, and notice that this node doesn't specify ballista totems, it's just totems. Now what this means is that you can use weapon swap tech to summon Shockwave Totem or Ancestral Warrior Totems with all of the gem level scaling from dual wielding 2-handers with Giant's Blood. Then you can switch to another weapon set to fire attack projectiles to make them trigger their damage a lot faster than they normally would do. So this is potentially a ton of burst damage, which as I said, is good for bossing and pretty terrible for mapping. Now overall, I'm actually quite a big fan of the Tactician. I think the Pin branch and the Reservation node especially are really good. And I think we'll see some pretty decent bow and crossbow builds on this ascendancy, and for the people who enjoy group play, there's some options there too. What are your thoughts on the Tactician? Let me know by commenting below, and thank you very much for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.